What card did you pull? I can't see it.
Oh, it was it's Justice Adjustment Libra. Really
Oh,
nice.
that's good.
Okay.
Kristen and Emilia, are you recording too? Did you start this?
Yes, I did.
Okay, cool. So we can let people in.
A lot of people. Wow.
Is that all the small lines up on the top of the Zoom?
I'm seeing on the side of my screen.
Oh, yeah, I guess everyone's different.
Jesse Merlin is in the house. Eric Middleman is in the house.
Wow.
Eric Middleman was the director of photography. You all met him at a certain
Oh.
point. You know, remember Eric? He's also editing it. One of my oldest friends.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to stay muted.
Hi, Eric. How are you? Chris Campion, hello.
I'm good.
I see Madeline, I see Clotilde. I see some of my folks. Thank you guys for being here. I know I announced it last minute. I'm honored to see you.
I don't want to like touch my screen. I'll probably do something, but hello to anyone I know.
Okay, do you want to start, Kristen, with the intro?
Yes. All right, I think we're ready to get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Witch-A-Thon, an online panel discussion and fundraiser for MAGICK SHOW presented by the Philosophical Research Society. My name is Kristen. I'm an event manager at PRS. And before we begin the Witch-A-Thon, I just want to say a little bit about PRS for those tuning in who might not be familiar with us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit cultural and educational organization. PRS was founded in 1934 by Manly P. Hall. So we are going into our 90th year in existence, which is wild. We have a 90-year celebration coming up later this month. It's kind of hard to sum up Manly P. Hall in a few sentences, but if I were to attempt to, I would describe him as a seeker and a really excellent communicator. I think first and foremost, he sought to understand reality for himself, and he did that by studying religions, philosophies, mythologies, and wisdom traditions from around the world. His landmark work, and the work that he's probably best known for, is The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which is an encyclopedic catalog of ancient knowledge, mythology, and rituals and symbolism from all of these things that he studied from cultures from all over the place. So in addition to his secret teachings, he also authored dozens of books, hundreds of essays, and delivered thousands of lectures, many of them in the auditorium at PRS, but he also lectured to audiences around the world. And PRS is a huge part of Manly's legacy as well. And, we're continuing to try to be a place for seekers. So if you are in the Los Angeles area, we are in the Los Feliz neighborhood. If you happen to be visiting Los Angeles, we would love for you to come visit us. We have a very, very active event schedule. The last few months at PRS have been some of our busiest months ever. Sometimes we have 4 or 5 events happening in a single day. And those events include lectures, screenings, workshops, performances on an extremely wide variety of topics. We also have a research library that is open to the public on Thursdays and Fridays, and it has about 30,000 esoteric books in it. We have a bookstore, and yes, we have a number of event spaces. So much more information can be found about PRS on our website, which is prs.org. And so that's just a little bit about the Philosophical Research Society. We're really excited to be hosting this event today. And without any further ado, we're going to play a little introduction filmed at PRS by the Library of Esoterica's Jessica Hundley.
Welcome, everyone, to the beautiful Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles, California. My name is Jessica Hundley. I am a writer, editor, and witch. And I'm so thrilled to be introducing this amazing event you're about to experience. We are bringing together some incredible witches, all in support of the wonderful show and Kickstarter campaign, help us all to kind of manifest this amazing program, the Magic Show. So sit back, relax, and join the coven.
So without any further ado, it's my honor to hand things over to the man behind Magic Show, Richard Metzger. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Witch-A-Thon. This is a fundraiser for the Magic Show Kickstarter, and I think a lot of you have already donated, and thank you very, very much for doing that. But if you haven't, and maybe you'll consider donating to it after during the course of this Witch-A-Thon here. I want to say a very sincere thank you to Jessica Hundley, whose idea this was in the first place, and also to everyone at the Philosophical Research Society, and that is Dennis Bartok, Alex McDonald, Kelly Carmena, Sarah Alessandrini, Kristen Phillips, and Amelia Turner. And they have been so generous in sponsoring this and backing this project, and I'm extremely grateful. And I have to say that the legacy of Manly Palmer Hall is in good hands. So, and now let me introduce the panelists. So first, the amazing Bri Luna, aka the Hood Witch. She's the author of a new book called Blood, Sex, Magic, and she runs the extremely popular Hood Witch website. Lisa Derrick, say hello, Lisa.
Hello.
Lisa has studied the occult for her entire life and is an art dealer, an award-winning filmmaker, and a Hollywood consultant on the occult. Haylin Belay is a trauma-informed health educator, a sexuality expert, a body worker, and a pleasure witch. I'm going to ask you to define that later. So Melinda Lee Holm is an author and a tarot scholar with over 30 years experience in the magical arts. She is the author of Your Tarot Guide, Tarot of Tales, Your Magical Year, and Elemental Power Tarot, as well as the co-author of Divine Your Dinner. Pleasant Gehman is a Los Angeles punk rock legend, a world-renowned burlesque performer, an author, and you guessed it, a witch. Arden Leigh, hi Arden, is a musician and educator, and Grant Morrison has called Arden his magical heir, which is quite the bona fide. I think everyone that's watching this will agree. And finally, Maja D'Aoust, the Witch of the Dawn, is a world-renowned occult scholar and the author of several books. And I think it's accurate to say that Maja has forgotten more things about the occult than I will ever know. So let's get into it. So I'd like to start off with origin stories here, right? I think that's a good way to ease into it. And witches are a lot like superheroes. And although I think some of us are born this way, there often seems to be some catalytic event in the lives of many occultists, a before and after happening, if you will. So there's several parts of this line of inquiry. But first, and we'll start with you, Bri, at what age did you start to realize like what witchcraft was?
Well, I was very much a latchkey kid. So growing up in like the early 2000s, late 90s, my real defining moment was I had a crush on a boy in high school and I wanted to put a spell on him. So I asked for a lock of his hair and he had like green Liberty spikes. So he let me cut off a spike of his hair, and that was when I was like, I'm gonna do a love spell on him, and it didn't work. But I will say, years later, I found him on Facebook, and we like connected, and I was like the weird little girl, and he like asked me on a date. So hey, maybe it did work. I don't know. But I think that was my first real attempt at, working magic from the books that I was reading and stealing from the mall.
Awesome. Guess that was a bomb with a long fuse, huh?
I mean, it really was, but I think, you know, more than anything, it wasn't just something that was like, oh, I'm like watching TV and like I'm gonna be a witch. I've always known that I was like a very like different magical child, but as I look back at it now, I would call like mediumship like death energy. So I've always been very psychically sensitive growing up as a little girl, and that was something that has been, I believe, passed on from me, from my grandmother to me, because she was really one of the most psychic people that I still know to this day. And that really was it. I think it's just something that's always been in my blood. But my real defining moment and my personal journey was a lot of like just books and being in the library. I worked in the library in high school, and I had access to so many great resources. And I looked really outside of myself at that time because I was, you know, you're young, you see things, you're influenced by like movies, but I never really looked at my own lineage or like my own family as being magical, because I was sort of, you know, when you're like younger, you have this idea of what a witch is or what it looks like, but I didn't know that it was already within my own blood, within my own family. And so looking back at that, as I got older and really, you know, like stepping into my own ancestry and looking into that and realizing like, oh shit, like it's already there. Like, there's just so many things that I think it's like not one defining moment, but I can say in terms of working magic as a child, I was consciously aware of what I wanted to do and what that looked like spiritually, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. So, Melinda, I'll pose that same question to you. Tell us your origin story.
My origin story, I mean, what you're saying about witches being similar to superheroes and there being some sort of event, I think mine kind of goes with that. I had the shitty childhood and needed to escape from it. And so I spent a lot of time alone and, you know, similar to Bri, in love with books, spent a lot of time hanging out at the bookstore where I could kind of be alone with nobody bothering me. And then I found this section, you know, the occult section, and was just like completely drawn in. And I was really intellectual kid and, you know, really loved school. And so the idea of there being like this whole section of learning and information that I could dive into was very attractive and seductive. And so, yeah, I was 15. I walked a couple miles to this mall near my suburban house. So I didn't drive or anything, and the bus didn't go right there. And then I went home with a tarot deck and a book on it, a book on magic, and that was it. I was hooked.
Fantastic. Now, Maja, I bet you have an interesting story.
I do. I was really sick when I was a kid. So when I was 2, I started having out-of-body experiences because I had really bad asthma and I would get pneumonia and then like just kind of die a little bit all the time. So I got really good at dissociating from myself and then seeing how things were from that perspective. And so I was always also isolated, similarly to Bri and Melinda, where I was just homesick. So like I missed so much school. I would miss months and months of school and just be in my bed reading books. And then, you know, similar to Dr. Kelvin DeWolf, my teacher, he had an injury, and in the hospital, when you just lay in bed all the time, you get real bored, right? And so you learn to go into yourself and into your mind, or at least I did. And so I started to have so many different consciousness experiences that didn't really line up with how most people were describing reality, until I would go to the library and then read these paganism books, read these, you know, witchcraft books. And I was like, no, this makes sense to me. So then from there, it was just nonstop karate chops.
Yeah. Haylin.
Well, I'm starting to see a lot of connective tissue between these stories already. I almost feel like it's like, oh, that was going to be my answer. So what do I have left to say? So my origin story, I think, again, taking a lot of those same boxes of in childhood having an intuitive or an innate connection to something and not coming to the actual language for that until much later. So I don't think I was using the word witch until college, and my approach to witchcraft and the occult was very anthropological in nature. It was very much an object of study. But then something in me made me think, there's like this museum near campus that was like this one Russian mystic, and he painted all these beautiful paintings. And I liked to go to, it was a very special place for me. And something in my mind was like, why don't I look up and see if there's a tarot deck based on his paintings? No reason for me to think that there would be, but there was. I bought it off of like a Russian website that I did not understand. Yes, Nicholas Roerich. Wow, I'm so impressed that somebody got that off of those clues. Yes, it was a Nicholas Roerich deck that I got off of a website that I don't, Google Translate was not helping me. So I didn't realize that they were miniature cards. They were like teeny tiny little cards. And half of them were spelled incorrectly. But I started doing readings to waste time during class. And every time I would actually be like, oh no, I have to sit and think about this for the next 3 hours. I thought I was just going to mess around and look at some pretty pictures. And actually, I'm having a really profound sort of experience that me, the overeducated, hyper intellectualized 20-something that I was like, well, I don't have an explanation for how that worked, but it did. And I would be stupid to act like it's not working, right? Like I'd be delusional to say that it's not working. So I think that was the point at which I broke through what I think is a important barrier, especially for those of us witches who do this professionally and in public, which is breaking through that barrier of like, I am comfortable identifying in the world in a way that I know is going to make a non-zero percentage of people look at me crazy. And that was especially true 10, 15 years ago. I mean, let alone further back than that. But even 10 or 15 years ago, that was a much more kind of controversial take to have. I definitely had well-meaning mentors who suggested that I take it off my website and my resume and, hide that from my professional life. But as Richard mentioned when he was introducing me, I do a lot of different things, and every single one of those things is informed by my witchcraft. So to not be explicit about it in those terms, like once I actually had the language and could look back and see how deep those roots went, like all the way back, again, it felt like I'd be silly to say like, oh no, we got to keep this in the closet and not look at this because it's unreasonable.
Fantastic. Lisa.
Oh, wow. I am an only child, or I was for a long period of time, and my parents were divorced, and I could read at an early age. So they just gave me lots and lots of books, and I believed that fairy tales were real, that magic worked, and as a test, that rhyme, don't step on a crack or you'll break your mother's back. Well, I tested it out and it does work. It takes about 2 years, but my mom sneezed one day and her spine shattered. And sorry, Mom, it was an experiment. But I had been doing, I know, Bri, come on. You're the person who says, how do you know a spell works? He dies? Come on. I mean, I didn't.
I love that. I'm sorry. I love it. That's why I was like,
okay, you looked a little appalled there.
no, I'm not. I love it though. It's magic.
Okay. I mean, it's science. Magic is the art and science of causing. Now, if it hadn't worked, then I would have said, oh, well, I wasn't being malicious towards my mom. I just wanted to see if stepping on those cracks would work. So, but I'd been doing magic before then, and I just continued. What I discovered was if I felt a certain way and thought a certain way, a situation would occur And I've done magic for as long as, I mean, I got in trouble in 6th grade for cutting a chunk of Cece Morgan's hair because she had really long blonde hair. But she wanted a voodoo doll so Bobby Hoyt would love her. And her mom called my mom, and my mom said, your daughter's the one who's chasing boys. So, yeah, I was lucky enough to get, I'm 63. So my mom took me to an astrologer when I was 3. I hung out in Berkeley with members of the OTO. Hollywood Babylon influenced my writing style more than anything until I read Thomas Pynchon, Mr. Metzger. And magic is how I live. And that's, yeah, don't step on a crack. You'll break your mother's back.
Well, that was a unique answer. Arden, how about you?
I got my start a little later, actually, in my late teens and my early adulthood. I was living in New York, and I was in a lot of very sort of masculine left brain communities. So the folks around me were really into NLP. I got my NLP cert, neuro-linguistic programming and hypnosis. But of course, that to them was different from like that weird girly witchy stuff, you know. That was more acceptable. But I moved out to Los Angeles in 2014. And I knew somehow in my body, I was like, I have taken this left-brained approach about as far as I can take it. I'm curious to really resensitize, get into my feminine, and I want to see what magic is about. I'm going to give it a shot. And someone whom I had met through the more NLP-oriented communities, because there is overlap between NLP and chaos magic, they sent me Grant's disinformation keynote speech from the year 2000 that was on YouTube. And I watched that. And of course, Grant says, don't just sit here and listen to my bullshit, go home, do it, do it, and we will change the world. And I took that as a sort of soft permission. And one of my very first sigils was I wanted to have lunch with Grant Morrison. And I figured like it was just lunch. So at the very least, like, they'd just be bored for an hour. Like, I'm not casting on someone. I'm not messing with that much free will, hopefully. But much to my surprise, and I knew no one who knew Grant. I had no connections to them. And much to my surprise, 10 months later, Alan Amato, a photographer who shot the artwork for my EP that I was working on at the time, Who Can You Trust, with my band Arden and the Wolves. Alan was having dinner with Grant and said, why don't you come along? Because I think Grant would really appreciate meeting someone who is really into magic and occultism and is getting started in all that, And so sure enough, we went to dinner and I met Grant. And even though I had sigilized for lunch, I was like, well, dinner's close enough, right? But then sure enough, another 10 months later, Alan reaches out to me once again. I thought like that was it, close enough, the spell worked, But Grant actually reached out to me again. Alan got in touch and said, Grant actually has some questions for you, can I share your email? I said, yeah, of course, absolutely. And Grant was reaching out to me to consult on their Wonder Woman series that they were working on at the time, because they were designing their villain, Dr. Zyko, to be someone who knew NLP, pickup artistry, and psychological BDSM. And I probably of everyone in the world at the time, I had the most experience with that intersection personally, which I won't get into a ton. But long story short, I wrote back and I said, yes, absolutely. Are you in town? I'd love to meet up. We can chat about it, if you're around. And Grant wrote back and said, well, actually, I leave tomorrow evening, but I'm free in the afternoon. Why don't we have lunch? And in that moment, going from watching that video the first time, having no connections to Grant whatsoever, and then another 20 months later calling in, when you realize when the first time that a spell that you really think is a long shot is going to work, it gives you a responsibility in your life all of a sudden. If you know that you can affect your reality, you kind of can't really complain about a lot anymore. I mean, you can, but then what are you going to do about it if you now know that this power exists? And that, in many ways, you know, ended my own patterns of learned helplessness and stuckness. I'd been through a lot of trauma. I'd taken on a lot of really poor trauma conditioning throughout my life. And it was from there, from taking that responsibility and also using, you know, in a way, the chaos magic initiation of nothing is true, everything is permitted. So therefore, your mind-body system, your belief system is your own domain to program, and your internal programming will thus affect your external reality. I went through that process of my own repatterning, and it was from that that I then created the Repatterning Project, which is the work that I now teach, which is remarkably not even, you don't really even have to believe in magic to understand, because it talks about how our patterns form and our conditioning and how we can change and reprogram those. But most people who go through it will come out the other side and be like, oh, I think there's something to this. Now I'm going to try magic too, because I see how much change is possible. And now I also have my own responsibility to create my own best life. So that is my origin story. And I'm very grateful. I didn't use any magic to call Grant in as a teacher, but we were a couple of years into our friendship, and I suggested, like, wouldn't it be more interesting archetypally if we were to take on an apprenticeship, because that would just make the characters that we are being to each other that much more fantastical. And I was so grateful they agreed, and they've absolutely enriched my life so much with their mentorship, which is still ongoing. So yeah, that's how I started, and that's where I am.
That's truly a superhero origin story in your case.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
A good one. Okay, and Pleasant. Now, I know that you had experiences that were odd and just odd experiences when you were a kid. Can you start with that? Some of these stories that you've told me.
Yes. So when I was the first psychic experience I had when I was about 3.5 or 4. We lived in the sticks way upstate New York, like on this old Revolutionary War era farm, and we were totally isolated. So I was playing in this little playroom that we had, and I was you know, I had like little horses out. I was watching TV, and all of a sudden a man's voice came into my head and said, "Tell your mother the barn is on fire." And it's terrified me. And so I immediately went hysterical and ran into the kitchen. And I was saying, "Mommy, the barn is on fire." And she didn't know what I was talking about. And she was like, "What are you saying?" And I said, "A man told me this." And she said, "What man?" And because there was never anybody even on the rural route. And so she ran outside, and our barn was at the bottom of this long slope down near where the road was. And it had just started burning. And so there was no actual fire department in that town, but my older brother and my father and the volunteer fire department came, and they put it out before it made a lot of damage. So of course I grew up, a lot of my life was spent pre-internet, so I had no idea that was clairaudience for a really long time. I still get it. It protected me once when I was around 11 or 12 and cutting school to go and smoke weed in the forest with a bunch of my friends. And a voice came into my head again and said, "Go home now." And I never disobeyed it because of that first experience was so wild. And then they all got busted for smoking weed. This was like in the 70s. And miraculously, nobody thought I like narked them out. But I've had constant experiences like that, not always clairaudience. And so I knew that I didn't really know for a long time that I was psychic, because I thought if you were psychic, you could just read people's minds nonstop. You know, I didn't know that it was like what a flash of intuition was, or you know, that, or when you just felt something in your bones. I didn't know. I thought I was like, I felt like my psychic abilities in those days were sort of like when you're trying to tune in a station, like on a radio or on a, you know, on TV or something in the olden days, that when it wasn't coming in, you know, so I didn't really think anything of it. But when I was around 12, I ordered this book from the back of Cream magazine, the rock and roll magazine, called Potions and Spells of Witchcraft, because I'd always been obsessed with being a witch or wanting to be a witch. And when it came, it was amazing. It was like, it was like, oh, it was like my Bible. Anyway, so then I knew what astral projection was somehow. And I was reading up on witchcraft and trying to do astral projection with my best friend Joan at sleepovers. And she wanted to just watch the midnight special, but I'd be sitting there saying, let's take off all our clothes and see if we can astral project to Freddie Mercury or David Bowie's house. You know, always just practical. You want to have a good destination in mind. Anyway, so as I got a little bit older, and especially as the internet became a thing, I'd already been practicing witchcraft, but then I started finding out a lot more about it, because in those days I certainly wasn't going to tell a lot of people about it for the same stigma reasons you guys were mentioning. Because I was already getting called witchy poo in school. That happened right off the bat without me mentioning a damn thing, you know, like from the kids TV show HR Puff and stuff. People would just call me witchy poo. They'd throw shit at me in the cafeteria. So other people knew fully before I did, perhaps. Anyway, so I kept having these experiences. I started doing more research on casting spells. I used to live right near I lived right around the corner from the Pan Pipes, which is now turned into Pan's Apotheca. It's been through many iterations. And so I learned a little bit of spell work from there and from books that I got from there, but it just kept progressing. And I'm still having wild psychic experiences. The reason I kept popping in and out of the frame, in case any of you noticed, was because one of my cats was sitting here wanting to be on Zoom, but it would have been too distracting. Anyway, so yes, then I wrote a book called Rock and Roll Witch. I wasn't, this was my 9th book. I think it was my 9th book. It might have been 10th, but I wasn't intending for it to be called that. I just wanted to write some memoirs, like all my books are memoirs. And then when I looked at all the stories that I was choosing to write, it all had like a witchy or paranormal type experience in it, including one where at my old punk house, Disgraceland, where I lived with Belinda Carlisle from the Go-Go's. She was really into witchy stuff too. And we were doing the Ouija board, trying to get in touch with silent movie stars. and instead, like the Ouija board kept doing crazy things. And then it's spelled house dirty, which was absolutely appropriate because it was a punk house. and then Belinda said, hey, and I just went, fuck you. And then all of a sudden it went, and it spelled shut up sluts. And then we were just like, ah, and we put it away. I could babble on and on, but I'm sorry, that was a lot. So I'll give somebody else.
Always good value. Don't you worry about that. I just actually want to say that I experienced your ESP recently. I was telling Pleasant a story, right? This long, elaborate story, and I'd gotten 2/3 through it. And we were recording her podcast, and I said, well, the third part of it is a little too personal, so I'll tell you that after we were done recording this. And she immediately said the thing that I was holding back. Immediately. It wasn't like, it was the next thing that came out of her mouth was the thing that I was holding back. Just want to point that out. She's a real fucking witch. That's what I want to point out. So,
yeah, you said that publicly. Thank you.
It's true, though. It's absolutely true. So back to Bri. when you self-identified as witch, when you came out of the broom closet, as they say, what was that like in your family? Was that an okay thing? Were your parents religious, or was this, were they just later cool with it?
I don't think my parents really expected anything less. You know what I mean? So I don't think it was more so my parents. It's more like aunts and uncles. But everyone always like knew that I was a weird kid. So I don't think that I don't think anybody's surprised about anything that I'm doing, my career choice or my spiritual path. I was always very I hate using this, but it's like the black sheep in a sense. So I always sort of marched to the beat of my own drum. I was very like defiant. They used to call me Brat Tana. So it's like I was always a brat, like bratty, not so much bratty, but it was just more so like in a household of like Mexican and Black people. It was like if you were smart and if you actually made like logical arguments with your family members about religion or like God and and like having like really challenging questions for a child, I think that was always seen as being like mouthy or being like bratty in some regard, but I don't think that anyone expected anything less.
Excellent. So Melinda, you were saying that you had a difficult childhood, and I'm wondering how your parents reacted to your interest in the occult.
They mostly didn't. I lived with my mom. My mom got custody. My parents got divorced when I was really little. I saw my dad on weekends, but they didn't really pay much attention to my actual life. And my mom was just she was either completely absent or she was focused on being very cruel, but she was kind of living at me. When I was ever around her, she wasn't interested in what I was doing. The only time she became interested is she found out that I had a tarot deck and she wanted to touch the cards, and I had read that you're not supposed to let anybody else touch your cards, and I really didn't fucking want her touching my cards. Like if there was one person that I could keep away from them, and she grabbed them. And it was the one time that I had someone violate the magical safe space that I had, right? And like I was being like violated and bullied at school and being abused at home, like my regular life that I was, I mean, it sounds awful, but like I'm used to it. But that felt like I can still feel it in my body as like more of a violation to have that magical space interrupted in that way. And now I don't speak to her, so I don't know what she thinks, but my dad and my stepmom it's just kind of a don't ask, don't tell. They're not really interested, and I'm not interested in trying to make them interested. So my chosen family thinks it's great.
Awesome. So Maja.
Yeah, complicated, but also easy. It was very obvious that I was. So my mom knew. I think it was like in second grade, she started taking us to the Episcopal church, which I guess is like church light, for any of you that have been to an Episcopal church. And I remember it was near Halloween, and the priest was asking, does anyone know about Halloween? And I immediately raised my hand because I was a bit still am a little bit like Hermione Granger. So I proceeded to tell the entire true pagan history of Halloween because I had read it in my grandpa's Encyclopedia Britannica, and then related it to the entire church. So my mom was like, yeah, she's probably gonna be a witch. But my mom was a hippie who I was conceived in Tibet in the Himalayan mountains. My older sister was born there because my mom met my dad up there. He was a drug dealer, and so he was running from Interpol, just hanging out, as hippies do back in the day. And so they had met up there. She didn't want to have another baby in the mountains because she'd had my sister there and literally had to give birth like by running to this chick's hut and being like, can you help me? Because there was no hospital. And so just didn't want to repeat that experience. So then we had moved back to Canada, and she, you know, Scorpio, had all this crazy stuff, was in Tibet studying how to make like the Tonka art, because she snuck into the temples back then in the, I think it was like the early 70s. You weren't permitted entry into Tibet because it was still like closed off by the Chinese government. So she would literally sneak around in the woods, and then they liked her. So she would come in and they would all just like talk to her and chat and stuff. So she was pretty, I guess you would say, appreciative of my knack for it and was supportive. Yeah.
I think I understand you a lot better after that anecdote. So Haylin.
I really want to watch that movie. That sounds like a really good movie, personally. I'd watch that story. Yeah, it's definitely, so it's complicated because my family of origin is from Ethiopia, and there is a tradition of magic in Ethiopian culture. And it's very clearly divided between like the good kind and the bad kind. And the word witch is exclusively used for like the bad kind. That's how that is translated into English. And it's very difficult to communicate across that language barrier, that when I'm saying witch, what I'm talking about is closer to the good kind, shall we say, of magic, meaning, so for many old school Ethiopians, if they heard someone say that, oh, I'm a witch, what they're hearing is like, I turn into a hyena to like, you know, eviscerate people. Like that's what I'm communicating about, what I'm bringing to the party. And that is so not the thing that I'm doing. That being said, I think it was Melinda who mentioned like my chosen family is really into it. And I would say even beyond just my chosen family, I mentioned earlier having my business cards and resumes have this information like front and center. It's right there on the center of my website. It's increasingly a thing that I do professionally also, but for a long time, it was a thing that was just adjacent to my professional work that I still thought was really important to bring into the picture. And I had a very well-meaning mentor. She was like the health director at Dalton at the time. Very well-meaning mentor of mine who essentially recommended that I take that off because she accurately and correctly pointed out that it was already scaring away certain clients, and it was already also becoming something that was associated and attached to my brand. And what I ultimately said to her was like, that's awesome. That's the point, right? Like if people see that and they don't want to work with me, that's good, because we would probably not have a good time working together. Because again, even though I'm not going into, you know, a 6th grade classroom to proselytize about tarot, but the way that I am a sexuality educator is informed by also being a pleasure witch, obviously. And so not being allowed to bring both of those things together, it's just not really an option for me as a values-led professional. This wasn't really going to happen. So being able to identify in public as a witch and kind of take that on as something that was not just like I can bear this burden, but actually it is not a burden, it's a blessing. I think that's how I characterize what my like coming out of the broom closet experience to be. It was really fun, actually.
Helen, what is a pleasure witch? Can you define that?
Oh, well, so it's not, I mean, there's not like a definitive book, you know, this is all very eclectic what we're doing here. But how I use pleasure witch, what I mean when I'm talking about pleasure witchcraft, is essentially, I guess if I could boil it down, is the idea that I believe that all people, by the virtue of being people, have the capacity for intuition and manifestation. The extent to which those things are possible, everybody has their own worldview. I'm not here to debate that. I think we can all agree, though, people can understand things and people can do things. Those are two like possible things to happen. So, you know, with that in mind, the type of witchcraft that I practice essentially is saying, I'm going to make pleasure the seat of power in my life. I'm going to make pleasure the intuitive feeling that I use to guide my manifestation, because like many people in this conversation have already mentioned, coming from a traumatized context and needing something to create that new worldview, you know, what better thing than like the thing that my body already evolved to teach me what to go towards, right? Like the thing that exists in my body to let me know this is good and you should stay here.
Thank you. So Lisa, you already kind of answered the question about what your parents thought about this, but what about your friends and your colleagues and your professional life when you sort of openly identified as a witch?
I started identifying as a witch in 6th grade, really, is when I had books on Crowley and Wicca and those little 25-cent books on candle magic from the grocery store. I've found that the majority of my friends do magic. I've tried to find friends in magical groups, and that's not as comfortable for me as having friends and some of them do magic and some of them don't. But it's such an integral part of who we are as witches that our friends either, I mean, it's not that extreme, at least in Southern California. I mean, there's vegans, there's breatharians, there's people like, it's just a segment of what we are. I think if I lived in another place, it would be a lot harder. And I'm I will say right now, upfront, total pitch for magicshow.net. It's proof that magic is real. Bri, I've wanted to meet you for ages. I've been hearing about you since 2016. Richard, in this documentary, people lay out who they are, how they do magic, and the importance of setting intention and focus and putting it out there. And that this film has been made and that we're all here is, well, success is thy proof. But anyway, I'm going to throw it over to Arden now. And please consider donating to our awesome Kickstarter completion.
Thanks for that, Lisa. Arden?
Yeah. So the question is, were our parents supportive of our witchcraft? Is that?
I guess so. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. My mom is witch-blooded as hell. However, she's never really quite actualized it. And we really only kind of found out about that within the last year, because I've made some peers who have introduced me to the concept of witch blood and lineage, and have, through that knowledge, have correlated certain hallmarks of my own life or my own expression that correlate with a specific type of witch blood, to the point where I cannot ignore that. I cannot dismiss that as a coincidence. And so then looking into my family and saying, where did this come from? It's quite obvious that my mom shares a lot of those traits. We're also both autistic as all hell too. So, which is another thing that I only found out relatively recently. And so growing up, she would be interested in things like, so this is not anything that we knew about ourselves until very recently, but she would, every once in a while, she would go see a psychic, or we had a set of tarot cards at home, but there was always this sense of like, oh, like, look, oh, this card is exactly the situation. Or like, this psychic predicted, like, isn't that wild? And for me at this point, I'm kind of like, well, I'm accustomed to. I now expect, man, I'm no longer surprised when magic works. So my mom and I have always had a really nice and really close relationship. My dad and I, as you know, my dad certainly, like when I was a teenager, you know, subscribing to 17 magazine, to date myself there a little bit. You know, there was an issue of 17 that had a set of like punch out major arcana tarot cards. So there I was with my 17 magazine, and my dad, who was, you know, an absolutely hypocritical Lutheran, you know, who was, yeah, nods of agreement, right? Was like, are you dealing with the occult? But I never liked I never sought out his good opinion. So I didn't really care. So with my mom, it was something that we could kind of explore and be like, oh, isn't this interesting? But it was really only after I started with the sigil magic and getting to know Grant and really committing to it as a practice that I expected it to work more often than not work. And I think the only friction that I've run into with my mom around my magic has not been about whether magic itself is real, or not been about whether I identify as a magician or practice magic, but there have been magical campaigns that I have taken on that have been extraordinarily challenging, that yet my divination and everything that I understand about the path will be like, yes, keep going, do this. Multiple diviners basically saying, if any of us just looked at this as a mundane situation from the outside, no one that this looks like the most toxic thing ever. No, you should not be doing this. You should not be engaging. But oh my God, when we read into it, we see exactly like it is all going to work out. And my mom, I think, has wanted to you know, like any mom would with their child, you know, or any mom that's close anyway, would want to protect them from those circumstances. And I finally had to sit down with her and said, like, Mom, do you believe in my work or not? Like, do you believe in repatterning? Do you believe in the potential for change? You know, and her coming back and saying, well, you can have an amazing professional life. And yet I'm like, no. Do you believe in the work ontologically? And we did cross that hurdle, because I basically said, look, and I've had to say this to so many friends along the way too. I'm going to follow my soul path no matter what. You can either trust me to do that, and if you have your misgivings, I get it, you know, I understand, but you can either give me your trust and support, or you can create alienation between us. And I think when you put it that way to people, they start to get it. So now, especially now that there are things that are happening that are coming in that are showing that I was, you know, not quite all the way there, but like there are things that are coming in that are like, oh, maybe I was right all along. My mom's always like, you know, she's supportive of hearing it. And she's always like, well, I guess you just got to be patient. She's like, where's that drumming fingers emoji? You know, like as we're texting. And so it's cool. As Lisa said, successes are proof. And yeah, so I'm pretty lucky in that regard, that overall my mom's been quite supportive.
So Pleasant, I know that you grew up with, your father was like a friend of Timothy Leary's. And so you were in a much more bohemian household, I think, than most people.
Yes.
So I think, did your parents basically accepted it, right?
Well, my father died when I was pretty young, but my mother, she couldn't help but accept it, because my great grandmother Rose, who I never met because she died like a very long time before I was born, she read tea leaves, and like in my mom in my grandmother's house grew up with that, at least, you know, they were Ukrainian, even though in those days they called themselves Russian. But yeah, there was always that. And then my mom, like, I just said to her one day, start looking for a new job because you're going to get fired, Mom. And I was very concerned. This was when I was about 11 or 12, and then she got fired the next day. So she couldn't deny the stuff that was going on with me. You know, also, like I said, a lot of my childhood was in the 60s, and then in you know, in the early 70s, anything went. So there was not really any judgment from her on those things. But you know, if she would have lived later, I don't she probably would have been happy I was making a living doing what I liked, you know, like doing tarot, having an occult burlesque show, just doing crazy crazy things, because she had a very bohemian life herself.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about tarot. That seems to be something that everyone has in common, and other forms of divination, horoscopes, trance, mediumship. How do you use these practices both for yourself and also for your clients? Melinda?
It's pretty much my whole entire life at this point. So tarot, for me, it was the first thing that really, really grabbed me. And I think I was really attracted to it because there's a pretty high learning curve to, just at the basics, like get all the meanings down for the 78 cards. And then it turns out it just kind of keeps opening up and opening up as you go. So for my own practice, tarot, I use the cards and spells and in rituals to bring different energies in. I use them just as like a, like something to look up to, instead of a person, like a tarot card or an archetype. And I'm writing books about it all the time to like keep investigating that system and this language and see where I can go with it. And with other people and with clients, I feel like the most important thing I ever say to anybody I'm reading for is that they're not crazy. People usually come, they want a reading because they're really confused about something that's going on. There's, if they had everything all figured out, why would they be here? And so when they're really confused about a situation and we lay down the cards, and my experience is that I'm just looking at the cards and I'm very fluent in this language and I'm reading the spread, right? I don't feel like there's anything coming through me. And, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. People argue with me about that. But my experience is just that I'm reading the cards and then I look up and people are so relieved because life is really, really complicated. And I think increasingly, as we're all connected in this globalized world, we want to kind of distill things down and to make things the same. And so when people have experiences that fall outside of that, it can be really disorienting and confusing. And to hear that reflected back makes all the difference. And then we look through and we talk through, okay, what's the path forward? Here's where it's headed. Where do you want to go? What can you bring in? What can you do to navigate through these energies we're seeing in the spread and get to where you want to be, not just to get somewhere that's predestined?
Great answer. Great answer. So Maja, what about you?
I definitely use the tarot almost every day. Have since my first tarot deck my mom gave me when I was like 16, and I use the same deck actually, and it's pretty freaky deaky because of the stuff that it does. Like the deck itself has its own special mojo for sure. But I also have a deck that I made called the White Witch Tarot, and then I have another deck that I'm working on now that'll be out next year. And as I work with my clients with the tarot, it's like Melinda said, it's a language, but it's also an immediate way. The way I see divination is they're like all divination based on archetypes is like a crystallization of someone's ability to tune into that archetype and that ancestor, and they have done the spiritual labor of crystallizing it into an image or a card. So it's like a little way of getting spiritual labor assistance, okay? Because someone has gone through, and multiple cultures, multiple people, hundreds and hundreds of people, right? And like all the history and heritage of these archetypes have come into this session to assist you to gain clarity through time, through space, and be able to see things from another perspective. So I don't really know how to let people know how important divination is, but like, unless you really can sit there and do a bunch of spiritual labor and connect in to, like Pleasant's voice, like Bri, like, unless you can do that labor and connect in, the ability of just being able to use a tarot deck and call in archetypes to do that for you is an invaluable resource, I feel like, because it will immediately put you into that meditative space and open the space, and then everything kind of just falls out, like it tumbles out into the space, like if you were rolling some dice. So And the images are so important because the person can just look at it. And sometimes it's so literal, like so often. And I'll just like, the cards aren't the same every time, but every time I see it, it's exactly reflecting the situation. Kind of like how Arden was saying, like, it's exactly reflecting. For example, this one chick was like asking about, you know, her crush. And she's like, where's my crush? What's he doing? And so we pull 6 of swords and I'm like, wow, it looks like he's on a trip with his baby mama, which was exactly correct. And I didn't even know he had a baby mama, but he was literally at that moment on a boat with his baby mama. So, you know, that's tarot, folks. Good luck.
So Haylin, how do you use tarot or divination with your clients?
Yeah, I'm going to try not to go completely feral for this question because I am really obsessed with it, and it connects to a question I did see earlier in the chat about discernment, which is a really important part of, especially as a trauma-informed practitioner. It's a really, really important part of my practice. And what I would say is like the cornerstone of how I work with people, right? Since I'm usually working with people who are trauma impacted in some way, and usually with spiritual trauma, a lot of times the first layer of resistance are the armor that they've had to put up against the toxic and oppressive religious or spiritual context that they came from, right? So people who are on a knee-jerk level, faith, belief, prayer, all of this stuff sets up red flags for them because their experience was that those things were used in harmful ways. So to come to something like tarot, as a witch, as someone who, especially as someone who sees witchcraft as specifically a framework of self-sovereignty, you know, if I believe that I have intuition and manifestation, that I know things and that I can do things, those are the 2 things that trauma really takes away from you, psychologically, spiritually, right? The idea that you don't understand the world and that you have no efficacy, you have no power. So my journey into, you know, intentionally identifying as and being and helping other people to be witches was centered in this idea that the only way to find discernment is to stop looking for something to replace the thing that you had before and understand that actually it's about developing an entirely different muscle, right? So an example, a very common thing that happens in first sessions with clients is they'll come to me and be like, I've been interested in this for years and I have all these books and they're on my shelf and I haven't read them or I haven't done anything because I'm really scared of messing up. And when we talk about it and we get a little deeper into like, well, what do you mean you're scared of messing up? The unspoken ideological back half of that is I'm afraid of doing it wrong and going to hell. So right there, we're already still in that, seeing that same framework from before that we're trying to get out of, that's like infecting the way that we're approaching the new thing. So rather than, you know, dressing up the old thing in new clothes, how can we develop the muscle of self intimacy and discernment to be able to say, like, I teach a class in which the spicy tagline is, what's the difference between intuition and anxiety? And I don't know if I have an answer to that, but what I can definitely say is the only way that you will know the answer for that for yourself is to have a profound and very honest understanding of what your anxiety is, right? Like the more you understand your anxiety, the easier it's going to be for you to identify that's anxiety, that's not reality, right? This is a distortion. It's a familiar one. I know it's showing up. I know to expect it and how to deal with it. So the way Melinda was talking about, you know, how that actually plays out in the interaction with the client, again, I think is where that power of self-sovereignty comes in, because it's not about me reaching into the ether and taking something that they have no way to access and being like, here is a deterministic fact about what's going to happen to you. This is your fate, right? That's not the style of tarot that I am doing. The style of tarot that I'm doing is, here's a deck of cards. They actually are not the most important thing here, right? In the framework of tarot that I use, the cards themselves aren't magical. The magic is happening when you, the person, looks at the card, interacts with it, and has an understanding or revelation of something you already knew to be true. I talk a lot about tarot being a language. I also talk a lot about tarot spreads being a form of poetry. And just like poetry, it's maybe not the most literal form of communication, but it can be extremely evocative, right? It can pull something out of you that was already there, but needed sort of a container to be put into. So sometimes that container is seeing the high priestess, right? And seeing the card and saying, oh, okay, so that's the thing that I didn't have vocabulary for. So because the tarot is a nonverbal language, because it has a visual aspect, and because it has a kind of randomness that I think is just very exciting on a psychological level too, this idea of, I mean, I think it was Arden was saying, like, it stops being surprising at a certain point. It stops being surprising. I don't think I ever stopped being like in awe of it though, especially working with like brand new clients I've never met before and doing a reading and just being like, this is crazy. Have you heard of this tarot thing? It's really crazy. It feels like a rediscovery every time. And as I was saying before, you know, part of the reason why I was able to identify as a witch was because tarot was such an undeniably useful tool. Like I couldn't really explain the mechanism of what was happening, but I could certainly explain, as Melinda was saying, this is giving me information about my current state. And as a social emotional skills educator, that's really the main thing I'm trying to teach people how to do, is how to look inward and be able to feel out the difference between I feel this in my gut and I feel this in my fearful center, right? And tarot being a really useful tool for doing that, because you can do it for yourself. Probably not a good idea getting in the way of my own business, but I'm like constantly telling people, like, pick up your own deck, start reading your own cards. You're going to be the best tarot reader that you ever have if you're willing to put in the work and do the deep introspection required to get into that divination. That's going to be the most rewarding thing by far, because again, to build that self-intimacy, that self-sovereignty, it's about getting to the point where you no longer need somebody else to check your work, right? So you have to have something that you do by yourself without somebody over your shoulder to say, yes, you're allowed to believe in yourself. And for me, tarot has been a very profound tool for that.
Fascinating answer. Lisa, how do you use tarot with your clients? Or any kind of divination?
Well, I used to read cards a lot for people, and I found they would get very addicted to it and they wouldn't want to make a move without, oh, please, you know, what's so and so doing, or can, and that was when I was younger and doing a lot more readings. And I also worked on a psychic hotline, which very much burned me out. Like one guy wanted to know when the price of corn would go up and what it would top out at. And at that moment, I realized that maybe working a psychic hotline was not the best thing for me. I use tarot in much the same way I mean, if I pull cards to see what a client may need, it's very helpful for spell work, timing, and also just a yay or nay. I was trying to do it daily, but life gets in the way. I do a regular tarot pull on TikTok, mainly for my own practice and to set intention for the day. But in general, I don't have strictly tarot clients. I have magic clients, so I use the cards to assist with that.
Okay, Arden.
I am so excited to answer this question because my divination practice, I'm in about like year 10 of practicing magic with any seriousness. And in this last year, my divination has popped off exponentially. And I'm going to share my system of what I do on this call. So, and I'm part of this. I have to give credit to my buddy Alexander Moore of Practical Occult. I learned this next part from his spirit diplomacy class, which is to combine a yes-no form of divination, such as a pendulum, which is what I use in my case, with a card, or in my case, with multiple decks of cards. And I have a dozen decks, 2 tarot decks and 10 oracle decks. Actually, 2 tarot decks, 9 oracle decks, and 1 copy of Oblique Strategies, which is like just tarot for boys and bands. I was sitting over on my coffee table. And what I will do when I have a question is I will start off with my pendulum and I will ask the question, and then I will say how many decks, 1, 2, or 3 or more. I have 3 settings on my pendulum, which is I have a yes, I have a no, and then I have an in between, which is sort of like, yeah, but that's not what we're really saying, or like kind of sort of maybe pull some cards for some more nuance. So basically I will use my pendulum and I'll say, all right, you know, how 1, 2, or 3 or more. And if it's 3 or more, 3, 4, or 5 or more, etc., until I know the number of decks. And then I say, first deck, is it in pile 1, 2, or 3? And I get the number of decks and which decks they are. And then I say, how many cards from this deck? How many cards from that deck? And I pull these cards. And then every time I pull the cards, I also use my pendulum and I say, is this the correct card? Because sometimes it will come back to me and be like, actually, you pulled 1 card over, shift these all over 1 and, you know, add the next one from the deck. And with that method, I have gotten the clearest divinations because I'm not expecting one deck with its own language and vocabulary to say all of these very nuanced things. I have an expanded lexicon, and I'm also letting spirit choose how many cards from which deck instead of giving it a pre-made spread. Nothing wrong with pre-made spreads, but doing this in quite recently, actually, has increased my spirit communication so much that for, I'm not going to say the first time, because I've experienced this before channeling in different states, and especially like doing ceremony and, you know, like hearing things and automatic writing, but it's gotten so much clearer specifically in my card pulls recently. I'll see the cards in front of me, and sometimes I will literally hear the words of what that means, and I'll say it out loud, and I'll be like, and then I check once again with my pendulum. I'll be like, do I have that right? And sometimes it comes back, and, you know, because again, you know, like Haylin was saying, you know, I also come from, you know, from a lot of trauma conditioning. I'm also an autistic femme, which means I am accustomed to feeling, you know, overly trusting or naive in some situations, or easily sort of gaslit. So even though my intuition is better than it has ever been, and I'm great at reading patterns and all of these other things, I still, for my own discernment, like to check and make sure that even my interpretation is correct. And most of the time it is, but sometimes spirit will come back and say, you missed something actually. And even then at the end, like, okay, did I get everything, or is there more for me to know? And that also helps because I also have ADHD. So I also have intrusive thoughts, and telling your intrusive thoughts from your spirit communication it's something that I feel pretty confident in. But again, there is never anything wrong with checking and being thorough. And because I have all those checks and balances in my spreads now, the information that I get is just off the charts. And I had something kind of cool happen recently too, which is that I've been doing for the past 2 months the Ars Notoria grimoire, which is a grimoire of rapid learning. And I've been doing it for learning the violin. I'm an adult. I haven't played violin since I'm 4, and I'm trying to do it. And if I'm sure many folks here are familiar with grimoire instructions, can be kind of obscure. And I noticed a discrepancy in the text. And so there I am with my pendulum. I'm like, all right, angels of the Ars Notoria, is this an error? What am I supposed to do here? Can you clarify the protocol for me? And in the middle of that, I get that thing on my pendulum that's like, yeah, but we have something else for you. And I go into what ends up being this hours-long conversation with these angels that I had originally called on just to learn violin. And they've been like, we've seen the work that you've done in this other area, and we're very impressed with you, and we want to help you. Draw up a petition of everything you need for this, and it will be granted to you. And all because I was just checking the instructions, you know. So I'm really encourage people, you know, with your divination. And I also saw that comment in the chat about discernment, and those checks and balances for me are also how I do that. And then if there is something that you feel like, because again, I'm so loath to give myself that main character syndrome, except in the past year, because I've seen it come through so many times I can no longer ignore it. But anytime it's like, oh, you're special, or it's something I want to hear, I'm always like, I don't know, am I just telling myself that or whatnot? But if you get a reading, it could be you hearing what you want to hear. If you go to a reader, one reader might give you something that maybe is not accurate. But if you go to 3 different readers and they're all saying the same thing, then you can pretty much be sure that that is an accurate message. So having those checks and balances for me is how I make sure that the information that comes through is in integrity. And I encourage everyone to try that, because if you haven't, it's really opened up my dibs a great deal in the recent past.
Pleasant, how do you use tarot and divination with your clients?
Well, I use multiple decks all the time because I feel like if cards repeat that, then, on a totally random deck, it's not a matter of sloppy shuffling. I also use it with pendulum constantly. And I like to also explain to the clients like sort of what each card individually means. I'll give them a whole reading just like at first, but then I'll tell them how I arrived at it so they can understand, like I like to let them know that. But I have found out over the years, and I don't know how this happened, but I get so many people that have had such deep traumas. Like, for example, well, there's a couple of examples. One was I was reading for a complete stranger. I'd never read for her before. It was a phone reading, and when as soon as I laid the cards out, I saw this giant neon sign in my head that said incest. And then I was horrified. I was trying to keep a regular voice, going on with her. And then, so I did the reading, and then I said, there's something that you're going to have to really decide on and think about. And she said, I know exactly what that is. And it's my children meeting their father who's about to come out of jail. And then she immediately said he molested both of them, and that's why he's in jail. So, I mean, stuff like that will happen. It's absolutely crazy. I actually told her that I saw that, but I didn't want to scare her. And then she just started being a regular client. But I've also, like, when I've read tarot parties, there's often other people doing either tarot or various forms of divination if it's a large party. And we always compare notes at the end, and I always get the trauma clients. I don't know why. I don't know what it is about me that attracts them to me. Maybe I have a sort of non-judgmental and nice aura or something. I don't know. But so at one party, everyone was comparing notes at the end of the evening. Oh, I got this actress and I told her she's going to get the part, or, just nice things like that. And they said, what were your clients like? And I said, stillborn twins, a father that just went into the hospital, and a best friend who got murdered last week. I mean, that's what so many of my readings are like. They're helping people through trauma. And I'm used to that now. But I also get lots of wacky and crazy readings that are really amazing. Like one time I got a reading for someone, and I did a reading for someone, and everything on it was either a 10, which is actually a 1 in numerology, or an actual ace. That was a crazy reading. And I just love the way tarot works. It's been my best friend since I was a child. It's really, really interesting to me. It never gets boring, and it's always spot on. Even when I'll tell someone and they don't believe it. Like I've had a few clients that got mad at me and then called me up or texted me like a few weeks or a few months later saying everything you said happened. So I don't know if that's the cards or being psychic, or if it's that marriage, but yeah, I love tarot. I can't be without it. Like I always have to make sure I've got a miniature tarot deck in my purse just in case, like carrying a spare tire or something.
I also just want to vouch for Pleasant, because she gave me a reading a few years ago where she predicted a whole boyfriend that I hadn't even met yet. It was astounding. So I can vouch.
Thank you, Doc.
So Bri, how do you use tarot with your clients and for your own practice?
So I am still doing readings quite often. I read for a lot of people monthly. And I will say that, like Pleasant, usually the message is it's not about cards. Like I can read people without cards. So
Yeah.
that's one of my strongest, I think, strongest focuses, I guess, in like magic. The cards are there because I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to share with you like the visual journey of what that story is. However, one of my earliest memories, and I guess like what I'm really good at, is gender prediction for babies or fertility or pregnancy. That's something I really specialize in with just strangers, you know, even when I meet couples, when I meet people, I just see flashes of a baby. And it's so funny because when I was a child, like that was something that I was really good at, like even just seeing like pregnant women. So that was something I always just kind of saw as like a silly, like maybe novelty. And as I got older, I realized, oh wait, no, I guess this is like a part of what your, you know, what your psychic mission is. I don't know, you know, when I look at people, but anyway, outside of that, how I use the tarot, I don't read for myself. I've learned a long time ago to stop pulling cards for myself, especially when it's something that I feel like I can't be objective about. So it's important. I have one best friend, she's my astrologer, and we read for not so much each other, but if I want like a very clear reading, like unbiased, I will not tell a certain person, like I want to hear what they have to say and kind of pick up. So I love the tarot. I love it because there's so much, I just feel like it's a practice where I'm never done learning, and you're always going to learn something. I met a reader, she was 74 years old, and she just taught me a completely different style or the way that I'm interpreting a certain card, or you know what I mean? Like I love meeting other readers and I love having people read for me. So when I moved here to Seattle, there was a group of readers that used to meet up on Friday nights, and we met at a church, and it was open for everyone. It was free. You just would bring a deck or, you know, bring your cards or whatever. And so it was just kind of like an open free for all, and you just get paired with just a random person. And so one night I got paired with a guy, and most people would say like, oh, he's like homeless, and they kind of like were looking down on him, like, oh, he's smells, he came from Louisiana. And he gave me one of the best readings of my entire life. And I miss him. I was like, God, I wish I could just find him. Like, he was incredible. Like, everyone was just so judgmental because, you know, he looked scary, but he was really the sweetest and most like magical and in tune people I've ever met in my life. And so I guess like with my own readings and like practice, it's almost like what Maja was saying, like it's sometimes very literal, you know, when she had her story with like the 6 of Swords, and it could be something with having like the baby mama on a Carnival cruise ship, you know, or it can be something as literal when someone's like, oh my God, like I'm dating this guy and like I'm so in love with him, and it's like I'm pulling the 7 of Swords, I'm pulling like the 3 of Swords, the King of Swords. It's like I'm pulling all of these things. I'm like, girl, like no, you got it. It's like enough is enough. Like we got to get out of this, like get out of here. So I'm very, like I tell my clients, I'm very no nonsense. I don't sugarcoat shit. Like I'm going to tell you straight up, like, hey, you might not like what I'm going to say to you, but I'm always going to tell you like what it is, but I'm also going to share with you, hey, well, maybe this would be helpful. You know, I'm not going to just give you like dump out the problem and then not give you a solution, or, you know, but it's up to you of how you want to take it. And I tell people that all the time. Don't call me every week. Don't abuse me as your 1-800 psychic number, because if I tell you some shit and you don't listen and you keep calling me over and over and over again, like I'm going to cut you off, because it's almost like it does become addictive, where people, they don't necessarily want to they want to hear these things, or they want you to tell them some different story, but they don't actually want to do the work and, you know, changing the life or the situation. So it's like at some point I have to say, yeah, no, this is not going to work out. Like when I see that pattern already starting, and I don't know who mentioned that, where it's like it becomes addictive. That's even with my own sister. My sister got super addicted to like tarot readings from fucking TikTok. And I'm like, not to say that there's people on TikTok who aren't good readers. I have not met a lot of reputable readers. I mean, maybe because I don't really utilize that platform, but it's like, from what I've seen, there are a lot of charlatans on there. There's a lot of like false information, and that frightens me. So I saw someone put in the comments, like, do you utilize technology with your spiritual practice? And I think, well, I think in a sense we all do. We're utilizing social media, you know, but when it comes to like AI in magic, and you know, that's a whole other can of worms, right? Like, I think that spending years studying and collecting books and physically being in the realm of spirit and physically interacting with people is something that robots and AI may never really understand, like having that experience, that in-person experience. So I don't know, I'm still kind of on the fence about it, but I'm open to see, you know, how things unfold. So I don't know. Anyway, I'm kind of like just getting long-winded about nothing, but like, I guess what I'm saying is I love tarot, and yeah, I don't know. Okay, I'm done.
AI can't be in tarot. That's
right. I was like, okay, enough of my rant.
You know, there's a question here that came in that about chaos magic and other more creative types of magic being a departure from, it just scrolled away. But
I can take it over if you want to. For a departure from the super by the book ceremonial magic that came beforehand, given that, what are your thoughts on predictions for the future of magic? And that's coming from Sly Stark. Thank you for that great question, Sly. So anybody want to take that one?
Yeah,
Haylin?
Yeah, I don't know if Lisa had something on her mind that she wanted to say first, but
talk, Lisa.
Oh, please go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, because this is something that I also gonna try not to go totally feral about, because I'm very excited about it. So earlier this year, I was unfortunately waitlisted, maybe fortunately waitlisted for a PhD program in counseling psychology. And the conversation that I had with the research assistants in the lab that I was applying for, and also the personal statement that I sent in, first sentence, "Hi, I'm Haylin Belay and I'm a pleasure witch." So the lab that I was applying to be a part of, the research that they are doing right now, like literally on the cutting edge of the field of psychology, is on this new, like, it's not that new, but this current iteration of interest and curiosity about witchcraft. Now, we could have a whole other 2-hour conversation about the mental health industrial complex and the reasons why psychology as a discipline is not the end all be all of legitimizing this practice. But as a mental health professional myself, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people who maybe do have a clinical background or they are practitioners, and they're asking me, where's the book that I can read that helps me sort of understand this overlap? And I have to tell them, like, I'm sorry, that specific book doesn't quite exist yet. There's a lot of books really close to it, but that specific book doesn't quite exist yet. So I've had conversations with people who are actively engaged in the process of helping to shape what a future of witchcraft is going to look like moving forward, which is, I think, I'll tell you my dream of what this looks like. This is my optimistic hope for what this looks like. My hope is that the discipline of psychology taking witchcraft seriously, because it's here, it's happening. People are using witchcraft to address their mental health needs. We're not going to get around that. So how do we do that safely and responsibly, especially given all the things we've been talking about today? We all work with trauma impacted people. We all work with vulnerable populations. People who are seeking out our services are oftentimes in very vulnerable positions. And if any one of us were bad people who wanted to make money, it'd be really, really easy to do so, right? This is an area where it's really easy to grift because people really want something. And so, you don't have to work that hard at what you're offering them. I think that's especially true on social media. I think that's why, like, again, not to say that everyone on social media is a hack, but I think if someone's main product is their social media presence, that to me is always a really big red flag, because the way that social media is structured is antithetical to a spiritual practice. I don't really know how else to frame it. So if we're talking about what the future of this, like, I think of it as just Instagram, like, witchcraft, that's very, Canva infographics about mental health and crystals, and it's all very close to being, it's like, it's useful enough to keep people subscribed, but not quite useful enough to actually be transformative or meaningful in their lives. My hope is that the discipline of psychology taking this more seriously means that there will also be more safeguards specifically for trauma impacted people, as in the same way that we have an understanding of what are the warning signs of grooming online, right? We have a list of things we know to look for. I want that for spiritual practitioners and from the perspective of trauma-informed mental health professionals. Again, with all the asterisks that those people are still not the end-all be-all of this work. But that's something that I am extremely passionate about, is finding ways to integrate this thing that has been put outside of the sort of main sphere, integrate that into like the broader conversation of, all of us curious people, all of us, I'm sure also other people in the chat, neurodivergent people who are just so fascinated by this human experience and just can't help but be obsessed with like thinking about it and how it works and what it is and what our place is in it. So that's my soapbox I'll step off of for now. But well, actually one last thing, which is that a lot of my clients are therapists, which I joke about sometimes as like, I'm your therapist tarot reader. So, those are my bona fides, is that's the population that I'm oftentimes working with, people who come from that clinical background and know there's a relevance to this work, but maybe haven't been able to find the place to actually meet at that intersection.
I would love to just briefly add something to what you said, Haylin, because I have a psychology degree. I got my master's in transformational psychology. And so I've done a lot of research into origins of psychology and prepared a couple courses. And actually, psychology comes from witchcraft. So surprise, surprise, all the psychologists like Freud, who then, of course, all of Vienna. Okay, you look at the birth of psychology really kind of happens in Vienna with Freud and all of his students, Reich and then Jung, and they're all studying these alchemical texts. Okay, so you can really track it back. In fact, a lot of them come from Anton Mesmer and his PhD thesis that they got a hold of in the library. Then he gets it from alchemy, which is really shamanism. And so you can see if you study books like Mircea Eliade, who I talk about so much in so many of the lectures that I gave back in the day, he looks at how psychology comes from alchemy, which is shamanism, because they were masters of fire and metal, and they were doing these studies. So it really pisses me off when all these clinical psychologists start going off about witchcraft and all the woo-woo stuff, because I'm like, listen, you would know nothing if it was not from these disciplines. And so the fact that a lot of these, scholars are trying to return, I'm absolutely passionate about trying to remind people that no, you are not figuring this out, and that people actually have to return to indigenous knowledge keepers and indigenous knowledge holders, because they're the ones that are the sources of all of this stuff to begin with. And yes, science is important, right? Psychology is important. Like, yes, I agree. There's so much open for abuse for snake oil salesmen, but actually snake oil is a very powerful medicine.
It is, and that's something I kind of want to chime into, where it was like Haylin was like, everything's about like infographics and crystals and da. Well, interestingly enough, over 10 years ago, a decade, when I started Hood Witch, I would attend esoteric book conferences. I was asked to speak at NYU. And being that I was going to be on a panel with a bunch of, academic scholars and PhD majors, I would look at myself and I was like, oh no, like I'm not as smart as them. Like I am just this whatever. And then I realized I was like, I got on these platforms and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm the only Black woman here. And I'm speaking from my lived experiences, and what I have to say is important. And it's not just about academia. It's not just about having these like armchair, occultists telling you what is and isn't magic. And a lot of the people when I started Hood Witch tried to reduce me as being like, oh, you're just an aesthetic, or you're just this and that. And I'm like, no, bitch, actually, I opened up plenty of doors between this intersection of witchcraft and, esoteric and occult knowledge being put into a space on social media and showing you a blueprint of how you can, one, not only just capitalize on your skills and reach a broader demographic than, your friends or your, small community. It's like it's allowing you to reach a broader space and reach to people who maybe don't have access or resources that, are in their area. I see so many young Black girls who are stepping into their power, and Latinas, because my mom is Mexican. And for so long, our spiritual practices have been demonized. And so now I feel like, yes, I am someone who I'm ruled by Venus. I am a Taurus. So it's like, I love the aesthetic of beautiful photography. And of course, my magic is going to shine in art and through my voice that feels authentic to me. Do I think everybody who now, obviously we see this like resurgence of this like modern witch renaissance. I'm seeing like hotels and like Starbucks and everybody has a crystal ball and astrology and a tarot. It's like, do I think it's inherently bad? I mean, it just depends. And this is where we need to have that discernment in who you're working with and why, and what are these people's credentials. But then even that gets a little bit mucky because, again, I am the person with lived experience versus someone who's like, well, I studied this, so I know it more than you. And I'm like, well, actually, like, this is a part of my lineage and this is my practice, and you're not going to take that away from me. So I do think it gets a little bit mucky now. And so I really do try to encourage that even with like my clients and like the younger generation of like, we'll call them like baby witches, to find their voice and to, find what works for them. And I guess that's just kind of where I'm at, like with everything. And so I'm really stepping into my own power where it was like, for so many years, having people reduce you and like minimize you into just this. And so I feel like as a Black and brown woman, no, I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to continue being in these spaces and sharing like, my experiences. And I think that has really resonated with a lot of, newer practitioners, or maybe some people who have been practicing and never really felt like they belonged in these spaces.
Thanks for that, Bri. I'd want to take a commercial break here for a second and remind everybody that this is a Witch-A-Thon, like a telethon. And if any of you have not donated to the Kickstarter, back to Kickstarter, maybe you will consider doing it. Those of you who have done it, thank you once again. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. We're actually 3/4 of the way through this or more already. This has been going really fast, if you ask me. I have a couple of questions that I want to get in, and then we'll take some questions from the chat. And the first of those last two questions is going to be, how do you think witchcraft works? What is the mechanism that makes things happen? And how can you tell if a spell has worked? So Melinda, we'll start with you. How does witchcraft work?
You know that my answer to this is so dissatisfying. My answer is, I don't care. I care that it does work. And like how does it work? And we're talking about, like witchcraft and all this stuff needing to be validated by these outside, by these other frameworks that are, like patriarchal frameworks. And I just don't need I don't need science to validate that. If it works, it works. So then the idea of how do you know it's working? Sometimes, I can't remember, think a few different people have mentioned, sometimes it takes a really long time, right? Like that you don't know. So if you're looking for, your end vision to be realized exactly how you envisioned it, and that's the only way to know if a spell is working, you might be very disappointed for a very long time unnecessarily before it works. So I think if you're doing a spell, if you are, if you're being true to yourself, if you are using practices that are your own, which I think is really important. I think that a lot of people feel the need to take on the practices of other people, and particularly Indigenous people, where it comes grabbing other people's rituals and stuff. Make your own, make your own ritual, or if you want to follow ceremonial magic or whatever it is, but do something that's really connecting with you. And when you're doing it every day, you have to keep participating. You can't just say like, hey, go and do this for me quick. Okay, cool, peace. Like keep participating in the magic and in the ritual. And if you're participating, you're already changing your life. It's working. If you've done a spell because you want to release some anxiety or some dread, and you walk away from that spell and go, oh, okay, I did something. Well, then it's working. And it comes back to like, how does it work? Like, I don't care. So if that works because the universe is listening and there's gods and angels that are coming in and they're like tinkering around in your soul to extract this thing, okay, great. But if it's just that you have clicked something open within yourself, that's great too. And I don't think that one of those things is more or less valid or more or less magical, really.
Great answer. So Maja, I know that you have a lot of ideas about how magic works.
I do.
Please have at it.
Spoiler alert, if you guys watch the show, I'll get into this in more detail because this was one of the questions that you asked in the show. But from my perspective, the reason magic works is because the entirety of reality is a deeply connected spider web of consciousness on all levels of sentience that goes all the way up and all the way down. We're connected to everything forever in eternity. And if you can find the little strand on the web that goes from one point into another, you'll be able to kind of weave together a little thing. So it's a little bit like fabric that moves and goes. To me, when I see it, it looks a little bit like a jellyfish with all these like tendrils to kind of extend out. And so the mechanism of magic is 100% interconnectivity of consciousness, okay? And there's going to be echoes and reverberations that you can play it almost like music. So there's a real mechanism that's penetrating reality that allows magic to work. It's not from imagination, right? So like, yes, we interact with it and our consciousness interacts with it, but we're not imagining this, right? It's actually structurally real. And that's why you can know that a spell works, because you're going to have a physical, real result in reality, right? No matter how much time that might take, as some people have mentioned, because you have to become a time magician if you want to work with the time stuff, right? So you're going to have to do some work with 4-dimensional stuff. P.S. If you guys want to get past that kind of time block, you can do some 4D work and that'll kind of assist you. But that's my quickie explanation.
That's a good one. Haylin, how do you think magic works?
Yeah, I think I gave a little bit of my Spark Notes answer to that earlier, which is I think that human beings, by virtue of being human beings, have these two fundamental capacities. I guess if you wanted to get sort of drilled down, it sounds so unsexy when I say it this way, but my witchcraft is so centered around the nervous system, the physical body, anatomy, neuropsychology. These are the places where I find many of my spiritual insights, in a deeper understanding of what this human animal, how it interacts with that reality. We know that like this human instrument is a flawed instrument for measuring reality, right? I'm looking at my cat napping right now. I know, I don't have to know a lot about science to know that the way that I see color and the way that my cat sees color are totally different. The way that we experience different senses are totally different. So how bold it would be for me to assume that the way that I'm kind of apprehending reality the cause and effect that I can see of like the apple falling to the ground, that's the only cause and effect that there is, and nothing else exists, right? So the way I conceptualize of it often is that I think it's sort of similar to that jellyfish tendrils that are sort of a part of everything. I think there are many things that this human instrument does not have the capacity to interact with when we're talking about the universal reality, whatever that even is. I don't think that we have an instrument that's capable of 100% understanding it, such that one of us could give you the exact mechanism by which magic works, right? But a thing that I often find myself saying, I don't know if it is capital T true, but I know that it's real. And that's really the more important thing from my perspective. I don't know if it's like a fact that I would be able to draw that connective line between, but I also know that to fixate myself on that as the goal before I like can live in the reality of that truth, that's a waste of my time.
All right, Lisa, how does magic work?
How is an engineering question? And I think the three previous ladies have summed up my answer so clearly and well that it would be boring and redundant for me. But I do want to touch on one aspect that nowadays with modern magic, what we might consider to be chaos magic is actually there is an order and form within chaos magic. And who is not to say that back in ye olden days, even if it's as far back as Crowley, that I mean they were pulling a little bit from here and a little bit from there, in the same way powwow and hoodoo drew from different traditions as well. Who's to say they weren't the chaos magic of their day? For me, how the importance of how magic works is 2%, 49%, 51. That 2% is what makes the difference. And that's regular practice, concentration, visualization, and focus.
All right, Arden, how do you think magic works?
I also feel that I don't have anything original to add to this question, but I would love to use my spot to touch upon the idea of magic versus the mental health industrial complex, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
So I work in mental health facilitation because that is essentially what the repatterning project is. And because of my own process of repatterning, and I think because of the way that my own mind works and functions in magic as well, I have a gift. I have an extraordinarily strong memory. So in my own repatterning, I was able to see during my own spiritual awakening repatterning, the points on my timeline that had generated the patterns that essentially function as behavioral algorithms or parts, right? We can also look at parts like internal family systems or folks with DID, right? Which is not the same thing, but related, as parts can be clusters of patterns. And I have in my own practice, for folks who have asked me for help, I have collapsed an average of 7 years of work in the mental health industry to get to, say, a DID diagnosis into a single session. And I've done that through setting that macro enchantment, right? Doing the ritual, basically saying, this person asked for my help, so I'm going to do I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to start this off with an intention to say, I'm going to pray for this person's healing and trust that my spirits will, lead me down the right path. And I've gotten to the point where through divination and through spirit communication, because of course those parts in a person are just spirits that happen to be anchored to a body. Yeah, Haylin gets what I'm saying. And if you can, even sometimes when those parts or those person's patterns are fighting against their own healing and not being cooperative and not even giving you the time that they would give a traditional therapist or trying to solve that in other ways, I have connected to those parts spiritually and through divination, come up with an entire parts map and timeline to say, this happened here, it generated that, this happened here, it generated that, this happened here, it generated that. In a way that I've never seen a mental health professional who is not in some way working with magic or psychism do. And what I want to say about this is me getting on my own mental health soapbox, but the mental health industry right now, there is a war between lived experience and the guys in the white coats. There is a conference taking place next month at Harvard on DID. And some of the folks there have even gone so far as to fake claim the folks on social media who are being open about their mental health diagnoses and do a presentation and say, well, we really can't diagnose this person because we haven't treated them, but we think that they're faking and here's why. And when there was pushback from the lived experience community, those doctors gave more pushback and have appropriated the term lived experience. There's literally a doctor who was giving a speech called like, my quote, in quotes, actual quotes, my quote, lived experience, treating DID for 20 years, talking over the people who understand and know this from the inside out and insisting that they are correct because they know what is in their textbooks. And so, as Haylin was also saying in terms of her owning her pleasure witch brand as part of her somatic work, I have also in the past been very wary because I don't want people to have to believe in magic as a prerequisite to do the repatterning project. But the more and more that I do this, and I've also facilitated lectures connecting occultists with lived experience practitioners in terms of looking at, there are certain forms of trauma that correlate with certain kinds of witch blood. Not all of them, but there are some that are bait. And if you know that information, and if you know how to connect to this, right? And if you can connect to those parts of a person's spirit, you can actually begin in many ways their healing on that higher self level. Have you, you can connect to those, you can start doing IFS with them, with their spirits and having their higher selves start to work out all of those issues, so that it creates more smoothness and it takes time for it to anchor into their lower selves, but you start that process. I am very proud to say that I've collapsed an average of a decade's years of once weekly sessions that would have happened in the traditional mental health industry into roughly a year and a half. And so I want to just say that our mental health industry needs an entire overhaul. And for those of us who are practicing magic, even though it's very scary and very edgy for me to talk about this right now, because of course, like as a mental health facilitator, you start talking about magic and there are some people who will dismiss you off the bat outright. But my experience has been that mental health requires in some way, there are certain kinds of traumas. You look at ritual abuse, for example, right? And that it was born out of magic, right? That was born out of things that are meant to sever a person's soul. And there are some things, there are some traumas that I think that maybe even only magic can solve in the allotted time that you have. Thank you for letting me using my spot on that soapbox. I think that was more useful than me trying to explain how magic works, which I think everyone did better than I could.
We've only got 5 minutes left, and I want to get one last question in. And if that last question was a hard one, this one will be probably the hardest one, I guess, to answer. Maybe not. I'm gonna hazard a guess that everyone who's assembled here, and probably a lot of people who are listening to this in the Zoom room, have had extensive experience with coincidences and oddball synchronicities happening to them. And I'm wondering if you can address that. But my question, I guess, is, what is that entity or that force or that intelligence or that being, or what is it that makes the coincidences happen? Because I think that's honestly the most important question we can ask ourselves about magic when you get right down to it. What is the thing that the Zen master asks, what is the thing that makes the coincidences happen?
I
Bri,
don't think
oh,
that's necessarily true, but I think the answer is it's the color that my cat can see that I can't see. It's like that would be my answer. Is like it's I don't know, and I don't know if it is knowable.
Okay. Bri, what do you think about that?
It's Satan. Just kidding.
Right. So about coincidences.
Make me want
What is the
You're
thing?
not
What is
supposed
the
to
thing that
tell
makes-
them, Bri. You're not supposed to tell.
Sorry, I just have to tell you, like, that's just it. No, I'm kidding. I really do think that it's just, I mean, it's the great unknown. Like, if we had this name for it, putting a name of like, well, what is it? Is it God? Is it Satan? Is it you? Is it your mind? Is it, you know what I mean? It's like, there's so many things. Everyone wants to put a label on something, and it's like, just be okay with not knowing, or defining that by whatever it is that you want to call it. I mean, I don't know. I'm just not someone who's going to like label what is the knowing? What is the name of it? What is it? Just is.
Well, it's the thing that you have a kind of a conversation with, you know what I mean? The Crowley definition is the holy guardian angel, the HGA, and he's always said that because he thought it was like the stupidest thing that you could call it. John Lilly, the guy that worked with Dolphin Intelligences and who took ketamine and got into an isolation tank. Maybe you remember that movie. What was it called?
Altered states.
Yes, altered states. Altered states. Thanks. Yeah, and so but he would call it Earth Coincidence Control Office.
Well, could I add to that? Because I label stuff.
Please do.
Which is a problem. But so to me, it is. There's a mechanism in this reality which extends past Earth. So I would extend his definition to include more than Earth. But there's a mechanism that attempts to put like things with like things. It's like, I guess, the law of attraction, if you really understand what the law of attraction is and see it from a higher, not so anthropocentric view, there is a law that brings things together through sympathy, through sameness, it's correspondences. Okay. And so when we get on these harmonic levels, it's music. Again, like I said, is the mechanism of magic. Synchronicity is the same thing. And so we're on these harmonic tracks, and that mechanism that is somehow physically embedded into this reality is putting those notes together. Those birds of a feather are coming in to flock together, right? Like if you imagine being in the Amazon jungle and these two birds, there's like a male and a female bird, somehow magically find each other through the whole jungle to come together and breed and make children, right? Like I always think of that with like fish in the ocean. You see those deep sea fish, and I'm like, how are they finding each other? Like, to me, how is this happening? There's actually a physical structure in nature, universal force that through sympathy brings things together harmonically. That's just an idea that I feel is like, I guess it's not like super specific, but it's kind of specific.
At the same time, correlation and coincidence are not causation. They may be symptoms, they may just be random side effects, and that's where we get into the need for discernment. Otherwise, somebody's deposit slip at the bank with a series of numbers, if you bought 1,000 lottery tickets and played those, or is it the layout of the cards that you got? There's a time and a place where correlation and coincidence lead into a non-beneficial chaos, and skill sets are important, and that's why we have Magic Show.
Anyone else?
I think it's just the way that I think it's like wishing on a star or setting an intention or any number of things like that. It's the law of attraction. It's the universe just sort of working to conspire with you to get things done, for you to meet people like the parrots in the Amazon. I mean, I've had so many moments of synchronicity in my life. I always, Lisa can confirm this, I will always say, wow, that's weird. And somebody says, why do you think it's weird? It always happens to you. Maybe it's just because I'm lucky, but I believe in all of that stuff that sounds very Peter Pan and Wendy, about wishing on things, about hoping for things. And that is what led me to magic.
Acting on it. You can't just sit on the couch with a wish in one hand.
Yes, you have to work on it too. You have to have the courage to do that. Exactly.
To know, to will, to dare, and
Post on social media.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have reached the end of this conversation. Seems like it went by very, very quickly, at least to me. So we are done. And I just want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank PRS and wonderful Jessica Hundley for coming up with this idea. It's been a lot of fun. And I also want to thank everyone who has supported Magic Show so far. It's been amazing, the reaction to this project. I'm really happy about it. And if any of you are in the chat room right now and you haven't donated to this Kickstarter, please go and do so now if you've had fun watching this this conversation. So good night, everyone, and have a magical day tomorrow.
Thank you, Richard.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you, wonderful witches. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.